When police arrested a homeless man for seeking shelter behind a warehouse, they thought it was just another trespassing case. But as a decorated combat veteran stood before the judge that morning, an extraordinary revelation would leave the entire courtroom in stunned silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The November wind howled through the narrow streets of downtown Portland, carrying with it the first bitter hints of winter. In the shadow of an abandoned warehouse, Thomas Reeves huddled beneath a weathered military jacket, his breath visible in the darkening twilight. A makeshift shelter of cardboard and tattered tarp offered little protection from the relentless drizzle that had become his constant companion. His calloused hands, once steady enough to defuse explosives in the scorching heat of Afghanistan, now trembled as he clutched a dampened newspaper to his chest. The headlines blurred before his eyes, meaningless words that belonged to a world that had long since forgotten him. To the hurried passersby, Thomas was just another shadow they pretended not to see, another reminder of a reality they'd rather ignore. A nearby church bell tolled 6 times, its deep resonance mixing with the sounds of evening traffic and the distant whistle of the cargo trains that Thomas had come to know as his nightly lullaby. He adjusted the worn duffel bag beside him. Everything he owned now packed into this single bag, save for the Purple Heart medal buried deep in its side pocket, a reminder of a life that seemed more like a dream with each passing day. The warehouse district had become his reluctant home over the past few months, its abandoned buildings and quiet corners offering what little sanctuary he could find in a city that seemed to have no place for broken warriors. The security guards mostly left him alone, some even nodding in awkward acknowledgement when their paths crossed during their nightly rounds. One guard, an older man named Mike, occasionally brought him coffee and day-old sandwiches from the corner deli, though they rarely exchanged more than a few words. Tonight, the air carried an unusual stillness, broken only by the occasional screech of tires on wet pavement and the muffled conversations of workers leaving their shifts at the nearby packaging plant. Thomas pulled his jacket tighter, its familiar weight offering little warmth against the deepening chill. The fabric still bore his name tape, though the letters had long since faded to near invisibility, much like Thomas himself. He reached into his duffel bag, fingers brushing past the Purple Heart, to find a small, worn photograph. The edges were creased and softened from countless hours of handling, but the image remained clear. A younger version of himself standing proud in his dress uniform, surrounded by his unit members after their last successful mission. Their faces smiled back at him, frozen in a moment of triumph and brotherhood that seemed to belong to another lifetime entirely. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention back to the present. A group of office workers hurried past, their conversations dying to whispers as they noticed his presence. One woman clutched her purse tighter, while another man steered his companion to the opposite side of the street. Thomas had grown accustomed to these reactions, but each one still stung like a fresh wound. As darkness settled over the city, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the temporary roof of his makeshift shelter. Thomas carefully tucked the photograph back into his bag, protecting one of his few remaining connections to his past life. The warehouse's brick wall radiated the last remnants of the day's warmth, offering minimal comfort against the approaching night. In the distance, sirens wailed, a sound that still made his heart race, triggering memories of chaos and sacrifice in far-off lands. He closed his eyes, practicing the breathing exercises his old VA counselor had taught him before he'd lost his housing and couldn't make the appointments anymore. The technique helped, but couldn't entirely quiet the echoes of his past that seemed to grow louder with each passing day. The rhythmic sound of the rain began to drown out the city's noise, creating a hollow symphony that matched the emptiness Thomas felt inside. He pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket, its pages wrinkled but preserved, and began his nightly ritual of writing. These words, never shared but deeply felt, were his way of maintaining his humanity in a world that seemed determined to strip it away. The warehouse's loading dock provided some shelter from the strengthening storm, its concrete overhang creating a temporary haven. Thomas had discovered this spot weeks ago, finding it preferable to the overcrowded shelters where the press of bodies and constant noise triggered his PTSD. Here, at least, he could breathe, could attempt to piece together some semblance of dignity in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn. A flickering street lamp cast intermittent shadows across his small domain, its unreliable light a fitting metaphor for his precarious existence. Tomorrow would mark 3 years since he'd last slept in a real bed. 3 years since the cascading series of events that had stripped away everything he'd worked to build after returning from his final tour. The memory of his apartment, his job at the security firm, his tentative steps toward rebuilding a normal life, all of it seemed to belong to someone else now, a stranger whose life he could only observe through the foggy lens of regret. Thomas pulled his military identification tags from beneath his shirt, running his thumb across the embossed letters as he had countless times before. The metal was warm from resting against his skin, the familiar texture grounding him in moments when reality seemed to slip away. These tags, along with his purple heart in the photograph, formed the trinity of his past life, tangible proof that he had once been someone who mattered, someone who served a purpose greater than mere survival. The early morning light crept across Portland's streets as Thomas made his way through his daily routine. His joints ached from sleeping on the cold concrete, a discomfort made worse by old injuries from his service days. The warehouse district was beginning to stir, delivery trucks rumbling past as workers arrived for the early shift. He carefully packed away his makeshift bedding, ensuring no trace of his presence remained, a habit ingrained from both military discipline and necessity. Memories of his time as Staff Sergeant Thomas Reeves, leader of an elite EOD unit, felt increasingly distant with each passing dawn. 10 years of service, 3 combat tours, and countless missions defusing IEDs in the unforgiving terrain of Afghanistan, all reduced to a collection of medals and memories stuffed in a weathered duffel bag. His unit had been one of the best, their precision and dedication saving countless lives. Now, those steady hands that once dismantled complex explosive devices trembled as he folded his tarp. The morning crowd began filtering into nearby coffee shops, their everyday concerns written across their faces as they hurried past. A young businessman in an expensive suit nearly collided with Thomas, too absorbed in his phone to notice. The man muttered an irritated apology without making eye contact, quickly stepping around him as if homelessness might be contagious. Thomas remembered wearing suits like that once, in the brief period between his military service and his downfall. A familiar face appeared at the corner, Sarah Chen, the owner of the small convenience store 2 blocks down. Unlike most others, she acknowledged Thomas with a gentle nod, sometimes even offering him day-old pastries or expired sandwiches. Today, she carried a paper cup of coffee and a brown paper bag. "Good morning, Thomas," she said, her voice carrying none of the judgment he'd grown accustomed to. "Thought you might need breakfast." The simple act of kindness brought a lump to his throat. "Thank you, ma'am," he managed, accepting the offerings with slightly trembling hands. Sarah had learned about his military service during one of their brief conversations, and since then, she'd made these small gestures of support whenever she could. Her own father had served in Vietnam, she'd told him, and she understood something of the struggles veterans faced. As Thomas sipped the hot coffee, real coffee, not the watered-down variety from the shelter, he watched the warehouse district come fully alive. Workers in hard hats and safety vests moved purposefully between buildings. Forklifts beeped as they reversed, and the morning sun cast long shadows across the industrial landscape. This had become his world, a far cry from the adrenaline-fueled missions of his military days, or even the modest apartment he'd once called home. The coffee warmed his insides, but the comfort was short-lived. A new security company had taken over the warehouse complex last week, and their guards were less tolerant of his presence than the previous ones. He'd already been warned twice about trespassing, each encounter more hostile than the last. The new head of security, a man with a permanent scowl and a voice like gravel, had made it clear that compassion wasn't part of their corporate policy. Thomas knew he should move on, find another relatively safe corner of the city to call his own, but something kept him rooted to this spot. Perhaps it was Sarah's kindness, or maybe the familiar routine he'd established. The warehouses themselves reminded him of the military bases he'd called home, all straight lines and utilitarian purpose. Here, at least, he understood the rhythm of life, could predict the ebb and flow of activity throughout the day. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He finished his coffee just as the first security patrol of the day rounded the corner. Two guards in crisp black uniforms approached, their boots clicking against the concrete. The younger one reached for his radio, while the older guard, the one with the gravelly voice, fixed Thomas with a stern glare. "I thought we made ourselves clear," he barked, hand resting meaningfully on his utility belt. "This is private property." Thomas began gathering his few possessions, movements deliberate and non-threatening. He'd learned to be careful around authority figures, especially those with something to prove. "Yes, sir," he responded, military courtesy surfacing automatically. "I'm leaving now." But as he stood, his duffel bag caught on a piece of broken concrete, spilling some of its contents. His Purple Heart skittered across the ground, coming to rest at the security guard's feet. The guard stooped to pick it up, his expression shifting as he realized what he held. For a moment, something like recognition flickered across his face, but it quickly hardened back into professional detachment. "Just get out of here," he said, tossing the metal back, "and don't let us catch you around here again." His voice carried a note of finality that Thomas knew better than to challenge. As Thomas walked away, his possessions hastily repacked, he could feel the guards watching his retreat. The younger one was already speaking into his radio, probably reporting another successful removal of an unwanted element. The weight of his duffel bag seemed heavier than usual, laden with not just his worldly possessions, but the accumulated weight of dignity lost, opportunities squandered, and bridges burned. The weeks that followed saw Thomas drifting between different spots in the warehouse district, never staying in one place long enough to draw attention. He'd learned to become a ghost, moving through the shadows of Portland's industrial maze with the same tactical precision he once applied to military operations. The early December weather had turned brutal, with freezing rain that seemed to cut straight through his layers of worn clothing. One particularly harsh evening, Thomas found himself back near his old spot behind the warehouse, driven there by a combination of exhaustion and desperation. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and the few shelters in the area were overcrowded with others seeking refuge from the cold. He knew it was risky, but the familiar loading dock offered better protection from the wind than his recent temporary sanctuaries. Sarah from the convenience store hadn't seen him in days, and he missed her small acts of kindness, the coffee, the occasional food, but mostly the way she looked at him like a human being rather than a problem to be solved. Her father had passed away recently. He'd seen the obituary in a discarded newspaper. The thought of her dealing with that loss alone made his isolation feel even more acute. The security guards were making their regular rounds, their flashlight beams sweeping methodically across the building's perimeter. Thomas pressed himself deeper into the shadows, using the skills honed during countless night operations in Afghanistan. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. Once he'd used these skills to save lives, now he used them to avoid human contact altogether. As he huddled in his hiding spot, memories of his last deployment surfaced unbidden. The scorching heat of the Afghan sun, the weight of the bomb disposal suit, the endless tension of working with devices designed to kill. His unit had been tasked with clearing a suspected IED field near a small village. The mission had gone smoothly until the last device, a sophisticated trap that had nearly claimed 3 lives. Thomas had disarmed it with seconds to spare, earning his Purple Heart in the process when a secondary device partially detonated. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him back to the present. The beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, and Thomas realized he'd let his guard down, lost in memories. The light found him before he could retreat, pinning him in its harsh glare. "Hey, you again!" The gravelly voice of the head security guard carried clear authority. "That's it. We're done playing games." Thomas raised his hands slowly, a gesture of surrender that felt all too familiar. "I'm leaving," he said, but the guard was already reaching for his radio. The younger guard appeared from around the corner, and Thomas recognized the look of someone eager to prove themselves. It was the same look he'd seen on young soldiers' faces before their first real combat experience. "Portland PD, this is Securitas at Columbia Warehouses," the older guard spoke into his radio. "We've got that persistent trespasser back again, requesting assistance." The response crackled back immediately. A patrol car was only minutes away. Thomas knew he should run, but something in him had grown tired of running. Maybe it was the cold, or maybe it was the weight of carrying his past for so long, but he simply stood there, waiting. The police arrived with efficiency that would have impressed his old military commanders. 2 officers approached cautiously, their hands near their weapons, standard procedure when dealing with unknown subjects. Thomas remained still, his military training taking over as he responded to their commands with precision. "Sir, you've been warned about trespassing here multiple times," one officer said, her voice professional but not unkind. Her nameplate read, "Martinez. We're going to have to take you in this time." The click of handcuffs felt final, a sound that seemed to echo in the cold night air. As they led him to the patrol car, Thomas caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window, a ghostly figure in a worn military jacket, far removed from the proud soldier he'd once been. Officer Martinez noticed his jacket, pausing briefly. "You serve?" she asked, her tone softening slightly. Thomas nodded, but said nothing. He'd learned that his service history meant little in situations like this. The ride to the precinct was quiet, broken only by the occasional crackle of the police radio. Thomas watched the city lights blur past the window, each street corner marking another step away from the small piece of territory he'd carved out for himself. The buildings grew taller, the lights brighter, as they approached downtown Portland. At the station, the booking process was mechanical, a series of questions and procedures that Thomas answered with military brevity. Name, date of birth, social security number. Each response a reminder of an identity that seemed increasingly distant. When they asked for an address, he simply shook his head. The booking officer marked transient on the form with practiced indifference. They assigned him a court date, Wednesday morning, 9 a.m. The paper they handed him felt flimsy, like it might dissolve in the continuing rain. As they led him to a holding cell, Thomas wondered if this was rock bottom, or if there were still deeper levels of descent ahead. The cell door closed with a metallic finality, and he sat on the hard bench, his duffel bag confiscated, feeling stripped of the few possessions that connected him to his past. The following days blurred together in a haze of uncertainty as Thomas navigated the complex maze of the legal system. Released from the holding cell with nothing but a court summons and his duffel bag, he found himself drifting through the city streets like a shadow, more lost than ever. The trespassing charge hung over him like a dark cloud, adding another layer of anxiety to his already precarious existence. He spent his days in the public library, one of the few places where he could escape the biting December cold without drawing suspicious glances. The quiet dignity of the space reminded him of better days, when he'd studied military manuals with the same intensity that he now applied to understanding legal terminology. Between the towering shelves of books, he felt almost normal again, almost invisible in a way that didn't ache. Sarah from the convenience store had somehow heard about his arrest. She'd left word with other homeless veterans in the area that she had some food set aside for him if he needed it. The gesture touched him deeply, but shame kept him from accepting her kindness. Instead, he wrote her a thank you note on a piece of library paper, careful cursive explaining that he appreciated her thoughtfulness, but needed to keep his distance until after the court date. The library's computer area became his command center as he researched similar cases and tried to understand what he was facing. The screen's blue light reminded him of long nights monitoring surveillance feeds in Afghanistan, searching for signs of IED placement. Now he searched through legal websites, trying to piece together a defense strategy with the same methodical approach he'd once applied to explosive ordnance disposal. During his research, he discovered that trespassing charges could carry penalties ranging from fines to jail time. The fines might as well have been millions of dollars for all his ability to pay them, and jail. Well, he'd seen enough confined spaces in his military career to last several lifetimes. The thought of being locked up made his hands tremble, forcing him to step away from the computer several times to practice his breathing exercises. A young librarian named Marcus had noticed Thomas's daily presence and his focused research. Unlike many others, Marcus treated him with quiet respect, occasionally bringing him printouts of relevant legal information or pointing him toward useful resources. "My brother served 2 tours in Iraq," Marcus had mentioned quietly one afternoon, sliding a fresh cup of coffee across the desk. never quite found his footing when he came back either. The nights were the hardest. Banned from his usual spots in the warehouse district, Thomas found himself seeking shelter in increasingly desperate places. One night, he slept in the doorway of an abandoned store, only to be rousted by other homeless individuals who claimed it as their territory. Another night, he rode the last bus line back and forth until service ended, pretending to be headed somewhere, anywhere. The Purple Heart in his duffel bag seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, a constant reminder of everything he'd lost. He'd earned it disarming a particularly nasty IED that had been planted near a school, the secondary explosion catching him as he'd shielded 2 younger squad members. Now it felt like a cruel joke, decorated for bravery, yet unable to find a safe place to sleep in the country he'd served. As the court date approached, Thomas began preparing himself mentally, much as he had before dangerous missions. He carefully washed his clothes in a public bathroom sink, pressed them as best he could with his hands, and made sure his military jacket was as presentable as possible. The name tape might be faded, but he could still stand at attention, still carry himself with the dignity that had been drilled into him through years of service. The night before his court appearance, he found temporary sanctuary in a 24-hour diner. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, kept his coffee cup filled and looked the other way as he occupied the corner booth for hours. Around 3 a.m., she brought him a plate of eggs and toast, claiming it would just go to waste anyway. The simple act of kindness nearly broke him. In the diner's bathroom mirror, Thomas studied his reflection under the harsh fluorescent lights. His face was weathered, beard streaked with gray, but his eyes still held the same determination that had carried him through firefights and bomb disposal operations. He straightened his jacket, ran a plastic comb through his hair, and practiced the responses he'd prepared for the judge. The pre-dawn hours crept by with excruciating slowness. Thomas watched the city slowly come alive through the diner's windows, the early morning workers starting their daily routines, unaware of the small drama about to play out in courtroom 304. He thought about all the people who'd shown him kindness, Sarah, Marcus, the diner waitress, and felt a sudden surge of resolve. Whatever happened in that courtroom, he would face it with the same courage he'd shown on the battlefield. The courthouse loomed before Thomas in the early morning light, its stone facade imposing and cold. He arrived an hour early, his military punctuality ingrained too deeply to ignore even now. The security check at the entrance caused his heart to race, not from fear of discovery, but from the familiar yet unsettling process of being scrutinized, scanned, questioned. His duffel bag was searched thoroughly, each item examined with methodical care. The security guard raised an eyebrow at the Purple Heart but said nothing, merely placing it back with surprising gentleness. Thomas noticed the guard's hands. They bore the same calluses that marked many veterans' hands, the silent badge of those who had served. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken understanding passing between them, before Thomas moved on, clutching his bag closer. The hallway outside courtroom 304 was already filling with people, lawyers in pressed suits, defendants in various states of anxiety, family members whispering in hushed tones. Thomas found a spot against the wall, standing at parade rest out of habit, his posture ramrod straight, despite the exhaustion that weighed on him. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a sound that reminded him of the generators that had powered their forward operating base in Kandahar. A young public defender approached him, clipboard in hand. Her name tag read Rebecca Torres, and she moved with the hurried efficiency of someone carrying too many cases. "Mr. Reeves, I'll be representing you today." She flipped through his file, her eyes scanning quickly. "Trespassing charge, first offense on record. We should be able to handle this fairly quickly. Just follow my lead, answer the judge's questions honestly, and—" She paused, noticing something in the file. "You're a veteran?" Thomas nodded, watching as she processed this information. Her expression shifted slightly, becoming more focused. "Purple Heart recipient, EOD unit. Why didn't you mention this during intake?" She looked up at him, really seeing him for the first time. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, unused to direct attention. "It didn't seem relevant to the charges, ma'am." Rebecca's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Everything's relevant in a courtroom, Mr. Reeves. Have you been in contact with the VA? There are programs. She was cut off by the bailiff's voice announcing the opening of the courtroom. We'll discuss this more later, she promised, gathering her papers. For now, just remember, honest, respectful answers. Let me handle the rest. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere changed. The air felt heavier, charged with the weight of judgment and consequence. Thomas took his seat beside Rebecca, his eyes forward, back straight, hands folded in his lap, the same position he'd maintained during military reviews and debriefings. The wooden bench was hard and uncomfortable, but he'd endured far worse. The judge entered, and the familiar call of all rise brought Thomas to his feet with military precision. Judge Eleanor Chen took her seat, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose as she began reviewing the morning's cases. Thomas watched her methodically work through several cases before his, each one handled with efficient compassion. Finally, his name was called. Case number 2024 CR 1857, City of Portland versus Thomas Reeves, charged with criminal trespassing, 2nd degree. Thomas approached the podium with Rebecca, his steps measured and purposeful. The judge looked up from her papers, her eyes sharp and assessing. Mr. Reeves, how do you plead? Her voice was firm, but not unkind. Before Thomas could respond, Rebecca stepped forward slightly. Your Honor, before entering a plea, we'd like to provide some context for the court's consideration. Judge Chen nodded, gesturing for her to continue. Rebecca began presenting Thomas's background, his military service, his combat experience, the Purple Heart. As she spoke, Thomas noticed a subtle change in the judge's expression. She removed her glasses, studying him more intently. Mr. Reeves, she interrupted, did you serve with the 55th EOD Company? The question caught him off guard. Yes, Your Honor, 2012 to 2019. Judge Chen's expression shifted again, something like recognition flickering across her features. She turned to her computer, typing briefly before looking back at Thomas. Were you involved in an operation near Kandahar in 2017? Something about a school? Thomas's throat tightened. Yes, Your Honor. April 15, 2017. We were called in to clear a suspected IED field near an elementary school. The courtroom had grown completely silent, every eye fixed on this unexpected exchange. Even Rebecca looked surprised by this turn of events. Judge Chen leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. Staff Sergeant Reeves, I believe you and I have something to discuss. She turned to the bailiff. Clear the courtroom, please. Ms. Torres, you may remain. The other cases would have to wait. As the courtroom cleared, Thomas remained standing at attention, his military bearing impossible to suppress. The emptying benches and shuffling feet created a hollow echo in the high-ceilinged room, each sound amplified by the growing tension. Judge Chen removed her glasses completely, placing them deliberately on the bench before her. The bailiff closed the heavy wooden doors with a resonant thud, leaving only Thomas, Rebecca, and the court staff in the suddenly intimate space. The American flag behind the judge seemed to stand more prominently now, its presence a stark reminder of the service they were discussing. Thomas could feel his pulse quickening, the same controlled anxiety he'd experienced before approaching an IED. Staff Sergeant Reeves, Judge Chen began again, her tone notably different from her previous judicial demeanor. My son was stationed at that school in Kandahar. He was part of the educational support unit working with local children. She paused, her composure wavering slightly. He was there that day, April 15, 2017. He told me about the EOD team that saved their lives, about the sergeant who spotted the secondary device and shielded 2 of his men from the blast. Thomas's hands began to tremble slightly, and he clasped them behind his back, maintaining his stance. Rebecca glanced between them, understanding dawning on her face as the connection became clear. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sound that seemed to fill the devastating silence that followed the judge's words. Your Honor, Thomas began, but Judge Chen raised her hand, silencing him. The gravity of the moment hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotion. The judge's next words came slowly, deliberately, each one weighted with personal significance. My son came home because of what you did that day. He came home to his family, to his children, because you were willing to put yourself between them and that explosion. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of activity in the hallway beyond the courtroom doors. Rebecca Torres stood perfectly still, her legal pad forgotten in her hands, witnessing a moment that transcended ordinary judicial proceedings. The morning sun streaming through the high windows cast long shadows across the courtroom floor, creating an almost theatrical setting for this unexpected reunion of lives touched by war. Judge Chen took several moments to compose herself, her usual judicial demeanor temporarily displaced by the weight of personal connection. The courtroom remained silent, the morning light casting long shadows across the ornate floor as she studied the man before her. No longer just another defendant, but the soldier who had saved her son's life. "Staff Sergeant Reeves," she began, her voice carrying both authority and compassion. "Would you please explain to this court how someone with your distinguished service record ends up charged with trespassing behind a warehouse?" Her tone held no judgment, only genuine concern and a desire to understand. Thomas maintained his military bearing as he spoke, years of giving mission reports surfacing in his careful, precise response. "After my last tour, Your Honor, the transition was difficult. The VA diagnosed me with PTSD and a traumatic brain injury from the blast exposure. The medications helped, but the side effects made it hard to maintain civilian employment. I lost my security job, then my apartment, the shelters." He paused, searching for the right words. "The crowding, the noise, it triggers memories I'd rather forget." Rebecca Torres stood quietly beside him, her legal pad now filled with notes, but she made no move to interrupt. The judge listened intently, her eyes never leaving Thomas's face as he continued his explanation. The bailiff, himself a veteran, stood straighter, recognizing the familiar cadence of a soldier's report. "I chose the warehouse district because it was quiet, structured. The regular patrols, the routine. It felt familiar, safer than other options. I tried to stay invisible, not cause any trouble. When the new security company took over, they had different policies. I understand that. I shouldn't have gone back, but with the weather turning." His voice trailed off, military discipline warring with the shame of his circumstances. Judge Chen leaned forward, her hands clasped before her. "And your contact with the VA? Social services?" The question was gentle but probing, seeking to understand the full scope of his situation. Thomas's response was measured, each word carefully chosen. "I was receiving assistance, Your Honor, but after losing my address, keeping appointments became challenging. The paperwork, the waiting lists for housing, everything requires an address, phone numbers, email access, things I no longer have." The judge nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. She turned to her computer, typing briefly before addressing Rebecca. "Ms. Torres, are you familiar with the Veterans Treatment Court program?" The public defender straightened, her face brightening with recognition. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe Mr. Reeves would be an excellent candidate." "I agree," Judge Chen replied, turning back to Thomas. "Staff Sergeant, this court has a special program designed specifically for veterans. It provides access to housing assistance, medical care, counseling, and job placement services. More importantly, it assigns you a mentor, another veteran who can help you navigate the system and stay on track." She paused, ensuring she had Thomas's full attention. "I'm prepared to dismiss these charges, but I want you to enter this program. It's not charity, Sergeant. Consider it a mission assignment. Your experience, especially with EOD work, could be invaluable to other veterans in the program. Sometimes the best way to find our own path is by helping others find theirs." Thomas stood perfectly still, processing her words with the same focus he once applied to analyzing complex explosive devices. The judge continued, her voice taking on a more personal tone. "My son. He's working with veteran support organizations now. He never forgot what happened that day in Kandahar. None of us did. Let us help you find your way back, Sergeant. You've more than earned it." The morning sun had climbed higher, its rays now streaming directly through the courtroom windows, creating a warm glow that seemed to soften the formal atmosphere. Judge Chen looked at her watch, then addressed the bailiff. Please inform the waiting cases that will need another 15 minutes. Turning back to Thomas and Rebecca, she began outlining the specific details of the Veterans Treatment Court program. The enormity of the moment wasn't lost on anyone in the room. What had started as a routine trespassing case had transformed into something far more significant, a chance encounter that might just change the trajectory of a veteran's life. Through it all, Thomas maintained his military bearing, but those who looked closely might have noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the moisture gathering in his eyes, signs of a man seeing his first glimpse of hope after a long period of darkness. The weeks following Thomas's court appearance brought changes more dramatic than any he'd experienced since leaving the military. The Veterans Treatment Court program moved with an efficiency that reminded him of military operations, but with a gentleness he hadn't expected. Within days, he was assigned temporary housing in a veteran-specific facility, a modest but clean room that felt like a palace after months on the streets. His mentor, retired Master Sergeant James Cooper, was a Vietnam veteran who'd walked a similar path decades earlier. Cooper's gruff exterior masked a deep understanding of the challenges facing veterans transitioning back to civilian life. "First thing we're gonna do," Cooper announced during their initial meeting, "is get your paperwork sorted. Can't fight a war without proper logistics, and you can't rebuild a life without the right documents." The Veterans Facility became Thomas's new forward operating base as he thought of it. The building housed 20 veterans, each with their own story of struggle and survival. In the common room, decorated with military flags and unit insignias, Thomas found himself drawn into conversations with others who spoke his language, not just military jargon, but the deeper vocabulary of service, sacrifice, and the challenging road home. Sarah from the convenience store had somehow learned of his new situation. She appeared one afternoon with a care package, coffee, snacks, and a handwritten note expressing her pride in his progress. The gesture brought a lump to his throat, reminding him that even in his darkest moments, there had been people who saw his worth. Judge Chen's son, Michael, made good on his mother's words. He visited the facility regularly in his role with Veteran Support Services, and his face lit up with recognition when he saw Thomas. "I never thought I'd get to thank you in person," he said during their first meeting. The two men spent hours talking about that day in Kandahar, filling in pieces of a puzzle each had only partially seen before. The program's requirements kept Thomas busy: morning group sessions, afternoon appointments with VA doctors, evening classes on everything from job readiness to meditation techniques. The structure felt comforting, reminiscent of military life, but focused on healing rather than combat readiness. His PTSD didn't disappear, but he learned better ways to manage it, to recognize triggers, and develop coping strategies. Cooper proved invaluable in navigating the bureaucratic maze of veteran services. Together, they tackled the paperwork that had once seemed overwhelming. Each small victory, a new ID card, updated VA benefits, dental appointments, felt like another step back toward the world of the living. Progress isn't always a straight line, Cooper would remind him, but it's still progress. The other residents became something of a unit. They watched out for each other, celebrated small victories, and offered support during difficult moments. Thomas found himself particularly drawn to helping newer arrivals, sharing the insights he'd gained. His EOD experience, the patience, attention to detail, and ability to stay calm under pressure, proved surprisingly useful in helping others diffuse their own personal challenges. Judge Chen kept tabs on his progress through the court's regular check-ins. During one session, she shared that his case had inspired her to expand the court's outreach to homeless veterans. "Your story helped us identify gaps in our system," she explained. "We're working to make it easier for veterans to access services before they reach crisis point." The warehouse district, once his refuge of last resort, took on a different meaning. Thomas occasionally walked past his old spots, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder of how far he'd come. The security guards who'd once rousted him now nodded in recognition. Word had spread about his story, and his regular visits to the VA clinic took him past their posts. One particularly meaningful moment came when he returned to Sarah's convenience store, this time as a customer rather than a recipient of charity. The pride he felt in being able to pay for his own coffee nearly overwhelmed him. Sarah's smile was bright enough to light up the whole store. "I knew you had it in you," she said simply, refusing to accept his attempt to repay her for past kindnesses. The purple heart that had once seemed like a bitter reminder of better days now sat proudly displayed in his room, along with new symbols of progress, certificates from completed programs, a calendar marked with appointments and goals, a small collection of books recommended by other veterans. The program was named in honor of the EOD team that had saved the school that day in 2017. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas, how his lowest moment, being arrested for trespassing, had led to his most meaningful work. He now had a new mission, one that utilized all his military training in unexpected ways. The patience and precision needed for EOD work translated perfectly to helping others navigate their own personal minefields of trauma and transition. The weekly check-ins at Veterans Treatment Court had taken on new meaning as Thomas shifted from participant to mentor. Each time he entered the courtroom where his transformation had begun, he felt a deep sense of purpose. Judge Chen still presided over many of these sessions, and their shared glances acknowledged how far things had come from that first unexpected reunion. As spring bloomed into summer, Thomas's influence in the veteran community continued to grow. Local news organizations began reaching out for interviews, interested in the story of the homeless veteran who had transformed into a powerful advocate for change. At first, Thomas hesitated, uncomfortable with the attention, but Cooper helped him see how sharing his story could inspire others still struggling in the shadows. Every time you speak, Cooper reminded him, another veteran might recognize themselves in your words. That recognition could be the difference between giving up and reaching out for help. The wisdom in those words helped Thomas push past his natural inclination to avoid the spotlight. The security company that had once called the police on him invited Thomas to conduct training sessions for their staff. Standing in the very warehouse district where he'd once sought shelter, he now taught security personnel how to recognize signs of veteran homelessness and connect individuals with appropriate resources. The company's CEO, impressed by Thomas's professional demeanor and insights, offered to fund a new initiative specifically focused on veteran employment in the security sector. During these training sessions, Thomas would often pause near his old sleeping spot behind the warehouse. The loading dock looked different now, not just physically, but in what it represented. What had once been a place of last resort had become a symbol of transformation, a reminder that rock bottom could become a foundation for rebuilding. Judge Chen's courtroom had become a regular part of his weekly routine, but now he sat on the other side of the gallery, supporting new program participants as they began their own journeys. The judge often called on him to share his perspective, his words carrying the weight of someone who had walked the path from defendant to mentor. His presence in the courtroom served as living proof that the program worked, that second chances could lead to profound change. The rhythms of his new life felt both familiar and strange, purposeful, like his military service, but focused on healing rather than combat. Each day brought new challenges and opportunities to make a difference, to help another veteran find their way back from the brink. The skills that had once saved lives in combat now saved lives in a different way, diffusing the invisible explosives of trauma and despair that threatened to destroy his fellow veterans. The ripple effects of Thomas's transformation began to extend far beyond Portland's veteran community. Word of the successful collaboration between Veterans Treatment Court and local businesses spread to neighboring cities, with delegations arriving to study their model. Thomas found himself increasingly called upon to share his expertise, his story becoming a blueprint for similar programs across the state. One crisp autumn morning, exactly 18 months after his court appearance, Thomas stood at a podium in the state capitol. The Oregon legislature had convened a special session on veteran homelessness, and he was the keynote speaker. The grand chamber, with its ornate decorations and historical paintings, couldn't have been further from the warehouse loading dock where his journey had begun. The gap between military service and civilian life, he told the assembled lawmakers, is not just about employment or housing, it's about purpose, identity, and belonging. His voice, steady and clear, carried the authority of lived experience. When we lose those anchors, the skills that made us effective soldiers can work against us. The same hypervigilance that kept us alive in combat can make it impossible to sleep in a crowded shelter. The self-reliance that we pride ourselves on can prevent us from asking for help. Judge Chen sat in the gallery, watching with quiet pride as Thomas commanded the attention of some of the state's most powerful people. Beside her sat Michael, who had taken a leading role in expanding veteran support programs throughout Oregon. Sarah had closed her convenience store for the day to attend, understanding the significance of the moment. The legislative session resulted in the creation of a new statewide initiative, with Thomas appointed to its advisory board. The program would replicate Portland's success across Oregon, establishing veterans treatment courts in every major city and creating a network of business partnerships to support veteran employment. Cooper, now officially retired from his mentor role, but still Thomas's closest friend and advisor, helped him navigate the complexities of his expanding responsibilities. "Remember," he would say during their regular coffee meetings, "you're not just representing yourself anymore. You're speaking for all the veterans who haven't found their voice yet." The warehouse district had become a model for urban veteran outreach. The security company had hired 15 veterans in the past year alone, and other businesses in the area had followed suit. The loading dock where Thomas had once sought shelter now bore a small plaque, marking it as the first location of what had become known as the Safe Harbor Initiative, a program that trained security personnel to connect homeless veterans with available resources. Thomas's work with law enforcement had evolved into a comprehensive training program. Police departments across the state sent officers to learn about veteran-specific crisis intervention. The program emphasized understanding military culture, recognizing signs of PTSD, and developing appropriate response strategies. Officer Martinez, who had arrested Thomas that fateful night, now helped teach these sessions, sharing her perspective on how a simple trespassing call could become an opportunity for intervention. The veterans facility where Thomas had started his recovery had expanded its programs, adding specialized services for women veterans and those struggling with military sexual trauma. Thomas worked closely with the staff to ensure that the lessons learned from his experience contributed to continuous program improvement. The facility's success rate had drawn national attention, with visitors from VA programs across the country coming to study their methods. Sarah's convenience store had become an unofficial hub for veteran outreach. She had hired several program graduates, and her simple philosophy of treating everyone with dignity had inspired other local businesses. The store's bulletin board, once filled with local advertisements, now displayed information about veteran services alongside success stories from the treatment court program. Judge Chen's courtroom remained the heart of the program, but its influence now extended far beyond legal proceedings. The judge had become a nationally recognized advocate for veteran justice reform, often citing Thomas's case as an example of how the legal system could serve as a gateway to recovery rather than punishment. Her approach to veteran cases had been adopted by courts across the country. Michael Chen had expanded his work to include international veteran support initiatives. The scholarship program at the Kandahar School had grown, now including exchange programs that brought Afghan students to study conflict resolution in the United States. Thomas occasionally spoke to these students, sharing his perspective on how military service connected people across cultural boundaries. The Purple Heart that had once seemed like a bitter reminder now served as a powerful symbol in Thomas's presentations. "This medal," he would explain, "represents not just sacrifice in combat, but the ongoing courage required to face our inner battles. The wounds we carry aren't always visible, but they're no less real, and healing them requires the same dedication we brought to our military service." 2 years to the day after his arrest for trespassing, Thomas stood before a different kind of audience. The annual Veterans Treatment Court graduation ceremony filled the largest courtroom in the Portland courthouse, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent rooms. As the keynote speaker, he faced rows of graduates, their families, program staff, and community supporters, a living testament to the program's success. Judge Chen sat at her usual place on the bench, but today she wore a smile instead of her typical judicial expression. In the front row, Cooper beamed with pride, sitting next to Sarah from the convenience store and Michael Chen. The security guard who had called the police on Thomas that cold night was there too, now a strong advocate for the veteran hiring program his company had implemented. "When I stood in this courtroom 2 years ago," Thomas began, his voice steady and strong, "I thought I had reached the end of my story. I was wrong. It was actually the beginning." He paused, looking out at the faces before him, some bearing the same lost look he had once carried, others shining with newfound hope. What I've learned since then is that our military service never really ends. It just transforms into different kinds of missions. The graduating class represented every branch of service, their ages spanning decades of American military history. Among them sat veterans who had once been as lost as Thomas, men and women who had found their way back through the same program that had saved him. Each of them wore a small pin, identifying them as treatment court graduates, a symbol of their journey from crisis to recovery. The skills that made us successful in the military, Thomas continued, the attention to detail, the commitment to mission completion, the unwavering support for our fellow service members. These don't become obsolete when we take off the uniform. They become tools for rebuilding our lives and helping others rebuild theirs. He gestured to the graduates. Each of you has proven that today. The program had expanded significantly under Judge Chen's leadership. What had started as a single courtroom initiative now encompassed a network of support services, employment programs, and housing solutions. The warehouse district, once a refuge of last resort, had been transformed into a hub of veteran-owned businesses and support services. The loading dock where Thomas had sought shelter now housed a 24/7 veteran crisis response center. Sarah's convenience store had become a model for community engagement, with other businesses seeking her advice on how to support veteran rehabilitation through employment and understanding. She had hired several program graduates, creating a supportive environment where they could rebuild their work history while feeling understood and respected. Thomas shared stories of individual transformations, the former Marine who now managed a successful security firm, the Army nurse who had overcome addiction to become a peer counselor, the Air Force technician who had started a job training program for fellow veterans. Each success story demonstrated the program's ripple effect, how one person's recovery could inspire and enable others. But perhaps the most important lesson, Thomas continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone, is that we're never truly alone, even when we feel most isolated. Every person in this room represents a link in a chain of support that extends from the moment a veteran reaches out for help to long after they've graduated from this program. He spoke about the countless small acts of kindness that had helped him survive his darkest days. Sarah's coffee and sandwiches, the library's warm shelter, the diner waitress who had fed him the night before his court appearance. These moments of human connection, he explained, are often the first steps back from the edge. They remind us that we still matter, that we still belong somewhere. The ceremony included the presentation of completion certificates, each graduate stepping forward to be recognized not just for completing the program, but for choosing to rebuild their lives. Judge Chen descended from the bench to personally congratulate each one, continuing the tradition of respect and personal connection that had become the program's hallmark. Cooper, now serving as the program's lead mentor coordinator, had implemented a new tradition. Each graduate received a challenge coin, specially designed to commemorate their completion of the program. One side bore the scales of justice, the other the words, "From crisis to victory," along with the graduate's completion date. The coins served as tangible reminders of their achievement and their ongoing commitment to recovery. Thomas watched as the graduates exchanged hugs and handshakes with family members, mentors, and program staff. These moments of celebration represented countless hours of hard work, tears, setbacks, and perseverance. Each success story helped pave the way for others still struggling to find their path. As the graduation ceremony transitioned into a community reception, Thomas found himself surrounded by a mix of familiar and new faces. Veterans from different eras mingled with judges, police officers, business owners, and family members, all connected by their commitment to supporting veteran recovery. The courthouse atrium, usually a place of solemn legal proceedings, had been transformed into a celebration of second chances. Sarah had organized the refreshments, coordinating with other local businesses to provide a spread that rivaled any military function. Her convenience store had evolved into a cornerstone of the veteran support network, and she had become known throughout Portland as someone veterans could trust for a kind word and practical assistance. Today, she moved through the crowd with trays of coffee, ensuring everyone felt welcomed and cared for. Cooper stood near the center of the room, surrounded by a group of newly assigned mentors he was training. His approach to mentor development had become a model for other programs across the country. The key, he explained to the attentive group, is understanding that every veteran's story is unique, but the need for connection and purpose is universal. His words carried the weight of years of experience helping veterans find their way back from the brink. Judge Chen and her son Michael were deep in conversation with representatives from other jurisdictions interested in implementing similar programs. The success of Portland's Veterans Treatment Court had attracted attention from across the nation, with many courts seeking to replicate their comprehensive approach to veteran rehabilitation. Michael's international connections had even brought observers from military support programs in other countries. The security company that had once called the police on Thomas now operated one of the most successful veteran employment programs in the state. Their head of security, the man with the gravelly voice, had become an unexpected champion for veteran hiring. He now stood with a group of recently hired veterans, sharing stories about his own military service and the importance of giving back to the community. Thomas moved through the crowd, stopping frequently to chat with graduates and their families. Each conversation reminded him of his own journey, how far he had come from that cold night behind the warehouse. A young Marine veteran, recently enrolled in the program, approached him hesitantly. "Sir," she began, her voice wavering slightly, "your story. It helped me decide to give this a chance." The moment struck Thomas deeply. He remembered his own turning point, standing before Judge Chen, how one connection had sparked a chain reaction of recovery and purpose. He spent time with the young veteran, listening to her story, sharing insights from his experience, and most importantly, helping her see that she wasn't alone in her struggles. The veterans facility where Thomas had started his recovery had expanded its services significantly. What began as temporary housing had grown into a comprehensive support center, offering everything from job training to mental health services. The facility's director had implemented many of Thomas's suggestions, creating an environment that balanced structure with understanding, discipline with compassion. Officer Martinez, who had arrested Thomas that fateful night, now led the police department's veteran outreach program. She worked closely with the treatment court, ensuring that encounters between law enforcement and struggling veterans became opportunities for intervention rather than punishment. Her team had developed protocols for identifying veteran status during calls, connecting individuals with resources before they reached crisis point. The warehouse district had undergone its own transformation. Several buildings had been renovated to house veteran-owned businesses and support services. The loading dock where Thomas had sought shelter now served as a testament to the power of second chances, its story shared during training sessions as an example of how circumstances could change when communities came together to support their veterans. Throughout the reception, Thomas observed countless small interactions that highlighted the program's success. A graduate introducing their mentor to their children, a business owner discussing job opportunities with a recently enrolled veteran, family members sharing tears of joy and relief. These moments of connection and hope were the real measure of the program's impact. As the afternoon progressed, Thomas found himself back in Judge Chen's courtroom, now empty and quiet. The space held such different memories now, no longer a place of judgment and consequences, but one of transformation and new beginnings. The American flag beside the bench seemed to stand as a reminder of the obligations society owed to those who had served beneath it. The graduates' challenge coins clinked softly in their pockets as they moved through the reception, each sound a small celebration of victory over adversity. These tokens of achievement represented more than just program completion. They symbolized the restoration of pride, purpose, and belonging that many had thought lost forever. The story came full circle on a bright spring morning, exactly 3 years after Thomas had first stood in Judge Chen's courtroom. He arrived early at the warehouse district, parking his car, a modest sedan purchased with his savings from his work with the veteran programs, in the same lot where he had once hidden from security patrols. The transformation of both the place and the man who stood observing it was remarkable. Today marked the official opening of the Veterans Resource Center, a comprehensive facility built through a partnership between local businesses, government agencies, and veteran support organizations. The former warehouse that had once been Thomas's shelter now stood renovated and repurposed, its brick walls cleaned, but still bearing the character of its industrial past. The loading dock where he had spent so many cold nights had been transformed into a welcoming entrance. Inside, the center hummed with activity as staff prepared for the opening ceremony. The ground floor housed immediate assistance services, everything from hot meals and showers to emergency housing placement and crisis intervention. The upper floors contained classrooms, counseling offices, and job training facilities. A special wing was dedicated to the treatment court program that had changed Thomas's life. Sarah had opened a full-service cafe in the center, employing veterans and offering a welcoming space for those seeking help or simply needing a moment of dignity with a cup of coffee. The walls displayed photographs documenting the district's transformation, including one of Thomas during his homeless days, a reminder of how far things had come. She had insisted on keeping prices low and maintaining the same spirit of kindness that had characterized her convenience store. Cooper, now the center's senior advisor, had worked closely with Thomas to ensure every aspect of the facility addressed the real needs of veterans in crisis. Their experiences, Cooper from Vietnam and Thomas from Afghanistan, bridged generations of veteran challenges, informing an approach that combined practical assistance with deep understanding. The mentor office bore a plaque dedicated to Cooper's decades of service to fellow veterans. Judge Chen would be the keynote speaker at the opening ceremony. She had become a leading voice in veteran justice reform, her courtroom model replicated across the country. The treatment court program had expanded to handle cases from throughout the state, with remote participation options for veterans in rural areas. Her son Michael had established similar programs internationally, creating a network of support that transcended borders. The security company that had once called the police on Thomas was now one of the center's biggest supporters. They provided not only facility security but also job training and employment opportunities for veterans. The head of security had become a close friend and advocate, often sharing their story as an example of how perspectives and policies could change through understanding. Thomas walked through the facility's halls, checking final preparations for the ceremony. Each room represented a piece of the comprehensive support he had envisioned during his own recovery: immediate needs, mental health services, career development, and most importantly, community connection. The building incorporated design elements specifically chosen to make veterans feel safe and welcomed, from the layout that provided clear sightlines to the quiet spaces for those dealing with PTSD. Officer Martinez, now Captain Martinez, headed the police department's expanded Veteran Outreach Division. Her team worked closely with the center, ensuring that law enforcement encounters with veterans led to support rather than arrest. The training program she and Thomas had developed was being adopted by police departments nationwide. As guests began arriving for the opening ceremony, Thomas took a moment to visit his old spot behind the building. The area had been transformed into a memorial garden, with benches and plaques honoring veterans who had lost their battles with post-service struggles. It served as both a place of reflection and a reminder of why their work mattered. The ceremony itself brought together hundreds of people: veterans, community leaders, program graduates, and supporters. The crowd spilled out of the main hall into the surrounding areas, where video feeds broadcasted the proceedings. Thomas sat on the stage alongside Judge Chen, Cooper, Sarah, and other key figures in the center's creation. His Purple Heart, once a bitter reminder of his service, now rested in a display case in the center's entrance hall. Alongside it were other medals and memorabilia donated by veterans, each telling a story of service, struggle, and ultimately, hope. The display served as a powerful reminder that behind every decoration was a human story of sacrifice and resilience. The center represented more than just a facility. It was a testament to how a community could transform when it chose to see and support its veterans. As Thomas prepared to address the gathering, he reflected on how his lowest moment had become the catalyst for change that would help countless others find their way home from their own personal battlefields. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.